200 of them stood on a mountaintop called Mount Hermon, and they haven't done anything yet. They hadn't taken any wives, no secrets have been handed over, and there damn sure isn't any giants. Every one of them could still turn around and go home, and their leader knew that. You see, Samjaza, he wasn't afraid of what they were about to do. He was afraid of doing it alone. And he was also afraid that when the moment came, the others, they would lose their nerve and leave him to answer for it all by himself. So he made all 200 of them swear an oath. They banded themselves together, so if one fell, they all fell. Then they came down to work that plan. The Book of Enoch says that what followed broke the world so badly that it took a flood to wipe the world clean. But here's the thing that I can't let go of. And honestly, I've thought about this numerous times after reading the Book of Enoch. There's a lot of cultures that had nothing to do with that book, and they remember beings just like this. Beings who came down before the flood, and they changed us. The first culture that we're going to dig into is Mesopotamia, but they didn't call them fallen angels. They called them gods. So, were these different legends, or were they the same beings, but just remembered from opposite sides? Somebody might have answered that question over 2,000 years ago, because buried deep in the Dead Sea Scrolls and inside a Jewish story about the children of these angels, there sits a name who has no business being there. The name is Gilgamesh. I'm your host, Stephen, and as always, I want you to remember your truth depends on where you're standing, and that, my friends, is relative perspective. Okay, let's go and stay on the mountaintop for a second, because the oath is the part of the story that most people tend to skip right past. Now, according to the Book of Enoch, Samjaza himself calls what they're about to do a great sin. And before any of this happens, he knows that there's definitely going to be a price to pay. And surprisingly, his only fear is that he's going to pay that price alone. Now, I want you to really think about that. They haven't done anything yet. There's no giants, there's no weapons that's being handed over, and there's no line that has been crossed. They still have time to walk away. But the first thing that they do is they take that option away from themselves. And honestly, that changes this whole story for me. When people talk about fallen angels, we sometimes picture beings who were caught in one weak little moment, and they made a terrible mistake. But that is not how Enoch described it. First, this was planned, this was sworn upon, and it was sealed. And the crazy part is, these beings, they know enough to expect punishment before they ever came down. But as you know, they came down anyways. Now, if you've read Genesis chapter 6, some of this, it already sounds a little familiar. Genesis says, and I'm going to paraphrase here, the sons of God saw that human women were beautiful, so they took them as wives. Now, some people claim that the Nephilim were mentioned in that same passage, and some people will argue that it's not the Nephilim, but I believe it's the Nephilim. And then the story of humanity, it moves towards violence, a lot of wickedness, and then the flood. But honestly, this is where we need to keep the Bible and the Book of Enoch in their proper lane. First off, the number 200, the oath on Mount Hermon, then you have some Jaza, Azazel, and the forbidden teachings. They all come from the Book of Enoch. Genesis, it gives us a doorway. Enoch, that's the text that walks us through that doorway. And in Enoch's version, taking human wives is only the beginning of what these watchers do, because they also start teaching. And in Enoch, he doesn't leave this knowledge vague. It actually tells us what they taught us. Azazel, he's the main one that shows us how to work metal. He teaches us how to make things like swords, knives, shields, and armor. Then you have other watchers that teach enchantments. Then they taught us the use of roots and plants, the movements of the stars, and the sign of the sun and the moon. What they're doing is they're handing humanity new ways to fight, new ways to manipulate the world around them, and knowledge about things that human beings were not supposed to get from them. Hell, even ornaments and cosmetics made the list. And before anybody comes for me, no, I'm not saying that somebody's eyeliner caused a flood. The point is that all of this stuff it arrives together. First, warfare, magic, seduction, power, and forbidden knowledge. And think about it. Once that kind of knowledge is loose on the world, you can't put it back. You can't teach someone how to build a better weapon and then make them forget it when they use it for the wrong damn reasons. Now, I want to be clear, at least the way that I read this, knowledge itself, it's not necessarily the villain. It's actually who delivered it. Another thing is why they delivered it and what humanity did with it once we had it. Because honestly, nothing gets better after the Watchers arrive. It does exactly the opposite. It seems like everything starts to fall apart. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the children of the Watchers. The Book of Enoch, they describe the offspring of the Watchers and these human women as giants. And this, I've often wondered how tall these things actually were. To me, this is where the numbers get completely out of hand. You got one old English translation that says that they were actually 300 cubits tall. And if you're like me, when I first read that, it really didn't mean that much because I didn't know what the hell a cubit was. But I went looking, and you got to check this out. Using the common estimate of 18 inches per cubit, that would put these things at roughly 450 feet tall. That's about the same height as a 45-story building. Now, look, I'm 6'7". People have been calling me a giant all my life. Hell, at 450 feet, I would barely make a speck on that damn thing's butt. And believe me, it gets a lot crazier because 300 cubits is actually the smaller reading. Another ancient reading gives us 3,000 cubits. Now, the manuscript trail, it's messy, and not every surviving version preserves this line the same way. But if you use that larger reading, the math is unfreaking believable. 3,000 cubits would put these things at roughly 4,500 feet tall. Now, if you want to know how tall that is, that's roughly more than 8/10 of a mile. And I know what some of you are thinking because honestly, I thought the same thing too. How in the hell did a human woman give birth to one of these things? Well, Enoch, honestly, it skips right over that detail. I'm assuming that they were born normal and they grew after birth. Because if they came out 450 feet tall, that's not childbirth. That's a damn horror show. Now, do I know which number was in the original version? No, I don't. The ancient versions, they don't all preserve this line the same way. And the Dead Sea Scroll fragments, they're really damaged. Somewhere during the copying and the translation of this story, a zero may have been added or lost. And the number may have also been exaggerated on purpose. And they might have done this to show that these creatures were beyond anything that humans could handle. Honestly, I don't know. We don't know. But whichever measurement you use, Enoch, I think, is trying to make one thing clear. These weren't just slightly oversized human beings. These things were damn monsters. And the world, it could not support them. The text says that the giants, they consumed every single thing that human beings produced. When humanity could no longer feed them, then they turned on the animals. And whenever that wasn't enough, that's when they turned on humans themselves. And that's the detail that really gets me. It isn't simply that these creatures were huge, it's that they never, ever had enough. The Watchers, they already gave humanity a new way to create violence. And now their own children were spreading that same violence across the earth. The whole world, it was becoming something that it was never meant to be. Eventually, the cries from earth, they reach heaven. I'm sure you've heard this name, and the name is Noah. He's warned that a flood is coming. Then Azazel, he is bound and cast into the darkness. Not only that, the other watchers, they're imprisoned to await judgment. And their giant children, they're turned against each other. Then the flood comes. But the flood, it doesn't remove everything that the watchers create. Because Enoch says that after the giants die, their spirits remain here upon earth as evil spirits. They're still afflicting people, they're oppressing them, And they're continuing all that violence that they started before the flood. And that right there, that gives us a really important distinction. In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers and the evil spirits, they're not exactly the same thing. Like I said before, the Watchers, they're imprisoned, and the spirits of their dead children, that's what remains here. And I really, really want you to hold on to that because when we reach some of the earliest Christian writers, they're going to make that connection almost word for word. Now, maybe you're thinking that this is a story that was created after Christianity had already started, but it wasn't. Fragments of the Book of Watchers, they were discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls there near Qumran. They were written in Aramaic and they were copied before Christianity. And after 2,000 years after those pieces disappeared into a cave, parts of the Watcher story, they came back into the light. The oath was there, the angels were there, and the forbidden teachings were there. I know that that doesn't prove that 200 supernatural beings stood on top of Mount Hermon. What it does prove, though, is that this is an ancient Jewish story. It's not a modern conspiracy theory, and it's not something created to copy the New Testament. But the Jewish writers who preserved this story, they didn't live in an empty world. All around them were cultures, and a lot of those cultures had much older stories about their gods. They had divine teachers, forbidden knowledge, a world before the flood, and a catastrophe that reset human history. And that takes us to the first group that we are going to compare with the Watcher's story. Like I said before, it's Mesopotamia because this is where the Anunnaki they finally walk into the story. But if you think that they're the closest match to the Watchers, you may be watching the wrong group of gods. Okay, Enlil, he's asleep when one of his servants wakes him up. Outside his temple, there's a group of angry gods that have burned their tools, marched through the darkness, and surrounded the building. Now, these gods, they're not asking for a day off. They're declaring war. This scene, it comes from an ancient Babylonian story called the Epic of well, let me see if I can get this right. Atrahasis. And according to that story, the lower gods have been stuck doing all the hard labor. They dig canals, they open waterways. Hell, they did so much that they helped carve out the Tigris and the Euphrates River. Day after day, they carry the dirt while the senior gods, they enjoy the benefits of all their hard labor. Eventually, the lower gods, they break. They throw their spades and work baskets into the fire. Then they march to Enlil's temple in the middle of the night and they surround it before anybody notices anything's going on. Now, look, we can laugh and say that even the gods get tired of upper management handing them another damn shovel. But look, this, it's a divine rebellion. There was a group of heavenly beings that has rejected the order that was placed over them. And the God that's in charge, he wakes up with an angry mob sitting at his front door. Now, if you've heard this story online, you were probably told that these guys were the Anunnaki, but they weren't. The gods standing outside that temple were called the Igigi. And in Atrahasis, the great Anunnaki were the gods who had imposed that labor on them. Now, the Igigi were the workers. The Anunnaki, they were considered the upper management. And that is the first place where this rabbit hole takes a very different turn, a turn from the version that most people have heard. The name Anunnaki, it's almost been swallowed by the internet. Some people, they've described them as extraterrestrial coming from this hidden planet called Naboo. And they came looking for gold, they altered DNA, and then they created humanity as a slave race. Now, could somebody believe that the ancient gods were visitors from somewhere else? Sure, that's definitely a theory. And we're definitely going to talk about what may have inspired that theory. But understand, the ancient tablets, they don't describe spaceships, they don't describe gold mines, and they don't describe DNA laboratories. Now, some people are going to tell you that the tablets, they say gold mines, and others, they're going to tell you that the tablets, they actually say irrigation canals. The actual text, they describe the Anunnaki as a group of senior gods. Their members and their duties change depending on when and where the story was written. Sometimes they decide fate. Then, in later traditions, they're sometimes connected to the underworld. Hell, even the number of Anunnaki, that number changes over time. But if you strip away the modern edition, it doesn't make the story less stranger. It actually makes it a lot more stranger. Because in the story of Atrahasis, the Anunnaki, they place the labor onto the Igigi revolt, and the Anunnaki then have to solve a problem. They don't solve it by picking up the dang shovels themselves. Of course they don't. They decide to create somebody else who can do the work. And that somebody is us. Later, the gods they call a council. And their solution is to create the new race. And that race is going to inherit all of the Agigi's workload. Now, this is how they decide to do it, or this is how they write that they did it. The mother goddess, she takes clay from the earth. Then they kill one of the gods, and his flesh and blood is mixed in with the clay. And from that mixture, everything mixed together, that is what they say. That's where they say that humanity is created. Now, if you grew up with Genesis like I did, I know it doesn't say it word for word, but it's hard not to notice the comparison. In Genesis, humanity is formed from the dust of the ground, and God, He breathes life into it. One story says that we're made in the image of God and given responsibilities over everything that He created. And the other says that we were created because somebody still needed their damn ditches dug. The Igigi, they went on strike, and humanity got hired without even filling out a damn application. Now, is that ancient genetic engineering? The tablet, it doesn't say that. But if somebody reads this and they wonder whether divine material mixed with earthly stuff could be an ancient way of describing exactly that thing. Honestly, I understand why that theory exists because whatever else we call it, this story says that something from a god was physically placed into the first human beings. Now, honestly, that is strange enough without adding any type of laboratory, and it creates a pattern that we've already seen. A rebellion among heavenly beings leads to the creation of something that's part earthly and part divine. Now, at first, the humans, we do exactly what we were created to do. We work, we build, and we multiply. Then, after we multiply enough, we become a problem. The human population, of course, it grows. And the noise that we create, it becomes so great that the god Enlil, he can't even sleep. So he sends disease to reduce the population. Kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? But there's another god, Enki, that helps the human population and Atrasis himself. Then Enlil, he tries drought and famine. Enki, he helps again. Finally, Enlil decides that he's done trying to control humanity. Hell, he wants us all gone. He calls a council of the gods, and all the gods agree that they're going to send a flood. And they make an oath that none of them are going to warn the human beings about what's coming. But Enki, he finds a loophole. He goes to the outside wall of Atrahasis's house. Now, I want you to picture this. This wall, it's made of reeds. And Enki, he starts talking to this wall. He tells the wall that the flood is coming. Then he tells that same wall that the house must be torn down and built into a boat. Now, I'm not saying that Inky's crazy because he knows that Atrahasis is close enough to hear what he's saying to his wall. But I mean, it's almost genius. Technically, he's not talking to Atrahasis, he's talking to his wall. Now, I don't know about you, but that's exactly the loophole that my kids would probably try to play on me. And matter of fact, they probably did. Atrahasis, he understands the warning. He builds the boat, he brings his family, he brings animals, and all the things needed to preserve life on board that boat. Then, of course, the flood comes. And after that, humanity is nearly wiped out. But Atrahasis and the lives inside that vessel, they all survive. Now, I know what you're thinking that the similarity to this is a lot similar to the Noah story. But the reason for the flood in these two stories are completely different. In Genesis and Enoch, the world it's become completely corrupt and violent. And then in the epic of Atrahasis, the gods they needed to create humanity. Then they tried to destroy us because they can't stand hearing us. So now we have an ancient Mesopotamian story, and that story contains a rebellion against the gods. Then you have humanity that was created from clay and divine blood. Then you have one man secretly warned, a boat, animals, and a flood that reset the whole world. And this story was being copied on clay tablets more than 1,000 years before the surviving copies of Enoch were ever discovered near the Dead Sea. So, yes, if you're wondering, the Anunnaki belongs to this story. But the thing is, the Anunnaki, they never make the Watcher's Oath. They never, I mean, it's never said that they came down together and took human wives. And Atrahasis, he doesn't describe them teaching humanity forbidden knowledge. The Igigi rebelled, but they don't fit the pattern either. For that, we need to meet the Apkallu. These were 7 divine sages that were connected to the world before the flood. These beings were basically remembered for bringing humanity knowledge, things like crafts, rituals, and the foundation of civilization. You see, the Anunnaki theory, it gets clicks, but the Apkallu connection has something much stronger to it. There's a serious scholarly case that says the Watchers may have been created as a dark reflection of the Apkallu. And once you put those two stories side by side, it gets really, really hard to ignore. Okay, let's go ahead and jump into the sages called the Apkallu. There was a Babylonian priest by the name of Berossus, and he recorded a tradition about a strange being known as Awanis. Berossus, he was writing it much later than the oldest Mesopotamian stories. So we're definitely dealing with later accounts. But I really want you to listen to what he says. It said that Awanis, he came out of the sea with the body of a fish, but beneath the fish's head was a human head. And he also had human feet that came out beneath the tail. And apparently, this damn thing could talk too. Now, during the day, this thing it stood with human beings. And it didn't just hang out. It taught them how to write, how to build cities, how to create laws, how to plant crops, and how to construct temples. Basically, he taught them how to build a civilization. Then, when the sun went down, Awanis, he returned back to the sea. Now, if something starts walking out of the Gulf and it's dressed like a damn bass teaching geometry, I'm going to listen. I'm going to be backing up, but I'm definitely going to be listening. Now, Awanis, he is generally connected with the first of 7 beings known as, like I said before, the Apkallu. Now, I don't want you to worry about remembering every one of their names. The important part is what they were. The word Apkallu basically means sage or wise one. And according to Mesopotamian tradition, 7 of these sages, they served 7 kings who ruled before the flood. And they advised those kings. Not only that, they brought humanity knowledge from the divine world. Things like writing, craftsmanship, rituals, agriculture, laws, and the skills needed to create an organized society. And just so we keep everybody in the correct box, the Apkallu and the Anunnaki, they were not the same group. The Anunnaki were considered gods, and the Apkallu were sages connected with the divine world, and they served as teachers and advisors. You see, it's the same religious universe, but it's different beings. But here's the detail that really grabbed me. An ancient manuscript that it places these 7 otherworldly beings, and they place them alongside the kings who ruled before the flood. Then the flood happens. And after that, the list it starts describing these otherworldly sages as humans. It's almost like the flood, it closed the door to something. Before it, humanity received knowledge directly from the gods. And after that flood, we were on our own. Now, look, the people of Mesopotamia, they didn't just tell stories of the Apkallu. They actually made figurines of them, little dolls of them. You had some that wore fish skin, then you had others that had wings and the heads of birds, and then you had several that carried buckets and objects that were connected to purification. Then people, they buried these little dolls under their floors. They also buried them under their doorways because they believed that these little dolls of the Apkallu protected their building. And not only that, they protected the people inside it. That was basically ancient home security. There was no cameras, there was no alarm company, just a bird-headed wise man buried under somebody's kitchen. Now, there's going to be people online that will point at pretty much every winged figure that was carved in an Assyrian wall and call them Apkallu. To me, I think that goes further than the evidence allows. But the figures that were buried during these protective rituals, it gives us much firmer ground to stand on. And it also tells us something important. To the Mesopotamians, these beings were their protectors. They were the teachers who helped humanity build the world. But the Book of Enoch remembers a bunch of teachers before the flood very differently. You see it already, don't you? You have supernatural teachers before the flood, knowledge handed down from a divine world. Then you have human civilization that's transformed because of it. And then you have a flood that wipes the world away. It's the same basic pattern, but they have completely different verdicts. Mesopotamia, they say that these beings helped build civilization. And then you have Enoch says that they corrupted it. You have one tradition that calls them sages and another tradition that calls them rebels. Now, the details, they're not identical, and I'm not going to pretend that they are. Hell, the numbers, they don't line up. There were seven pre-flood Apkallu, and then there was 200 watchers. Then you had the Apkallu that were closely connected with wisdom and the waters of the deep. And then the watchers, they descended from heaven, took human wives, and created those damn giants. So, no, we cannot say that we've proven that these are exact same beings. But that pattern, it's hard to ignore. And that's what made me so interested in this topic. Now, there's a scholar by the name of Amar Anus, and he argues that the Watchers may have been created as a dark reflection of the Apkallu. Now, this is a serious scholarly theory, but it's still a theory. It doesn't prove that the Apkallu and the Watchers were the same beings. The argument is that the writers behind Enoch, they may have known the Mesopotamian tradition, and they tried to turn its meaning upside down. Mesopotamia said that these beings gave us civilization, and Enoch's answer was that they gave you knowledge that you were never supposed to have, especially not from them. And here's where the whole thing it gets a lot darker. You had some Mesopotamian traditions that had already started connecting these sages to dark magic and witchcraft. And not only that, they connected some of them to forces that could harm people. So maybe Enoch, it didn't invent the accusation. Maybe it took a suspicion that was already there and made it the entire story. Because what if the knowledge that created civilization, it wasn't really a gift? What if it was actually contraband? What if weapons, sorcery, and the ability to manipulate the natural world, they weren't signs that humanity was actually advancing? What if they were actually evidence that something did interfere with us? In that version of the story, the flood, it wasn't punishment for only violence. It was an attempt to contain what had been unleashed. Now, remember that name that I told you about in the beginning? Among the Dead Sea Scrolls found in Qumran, there were fragments of a Jewish work known as the Book of Giants. And that book belongs to the Enochian tradition. And it also tells a story of enormous children that were born of watchers and human women. Now, I understand that the fragments are badly damaged, so a lot of the story is missing. But one of the names that is preserved in one of those fragments is the name Gilgamesh. Yes, that same Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk and the hero of one of the oldest epic stories ever written. This was a Mesopotamian hero, and he's sitting inside a Jewish story written about the giant children of watchers. So we're no longer dealing with two modern people saying, hey, these old stories sound kind of familiar. Somewhere in the ancient worlds, these two traditions, they had already crossed paths. So how in the hell did his name end up in the Book of Giants? Now, I want you to hold on to that question because before I answer it, you need to see why his name being there is such a problem. Okay, here's the problem. To me, Gilgamesh, he should not be in the Book of Giants. In his own epic, the flood was ancient history. It happened generations before he was even born, and he spent the rest of his life chasing the one man who survived it. But the Book of Giants, it tells a story before the flood, and Gilgamesh is in it. So whoever wrote this, he wasn't continuing the epic like it was some sort of part two to his story. They took the name of a famous Mesopotamian hero and they set it down on the wrong side of the flood. Unless, to that writer, that's exactly where it belonged. Now, the fragments of the Book of the Giants, they're torn to hell. But I think we have enough to understand what's happening. The giants, they're having nightmares. They say they can't sleep. Then they gather together to try to understand the meaning of their dreams. And slowly, they realize that something is coming to destroy them. Now, one of them admits that he had been powerful enough to fight anything that was made of flesh, but he couldn't stand against beings of heaven. They were way, way stronger than he was. And honestly, that line gets me. These creatures, they had spent their entire lives being the things that everybody on earth was afraid of. And now they were scared to go back to sleep. So, what they did was they sent a messenger to find Enoch. And I want you to think about that for a second. Their fathers had rebelled against heaven, and their very existence it came from that rebellion. But when everything started to fall apart, the children they went looking for the one man who still had God's ear. And the message that came back was exactly what they feared. The flood, it was definitely coming. Their fathers, they were going to be bound, and all the giants, they were going to be destroyed. That is the story where the name Gilgamesh appears. And Gilgamesh's name, it survives twice in different fragments. And here's the honest limit of what we know. Too much of the text is missing to say exactly what his role really was. Some scholars read him as one of the giants. And then you had other people that believed him as a separate character, and that character was connected with interpreting the dreams. But when you look at the way that Mesopotamian described this man, the epic calls him two-thirds divine and one-third human. I don't know how anybody arrived at that math, but the tablet, it seems pretty confident about what they came up with. It also describes him as over 16 feet tall. So we have a figure that wasn't considered fully human. He had divine ancestry and was described as an absolute monster of a man. Now, in part of the story, one of his best friends, which was created to be basically like Gilgamesh, he dies. And then Gilgamesh learned that all that size and strength, it still couldn't save him from death. That is why Gilgamesh spent the rest of his life looking for somebody named Utnapishtim. This was a man before the flood who had been granted immortality. So, why is his name in the Book of Giants? Maybe the writer, he just borrowed a famous name. Maybe there was another Gilgamesh tradition that had been lost. Or maybe putting him on the wrong side of the flood was completely deliberate. Because to that writer, a king who was part God and part man, he belonged right there with the children of the Watchers. Honestly, we can't prove which one is right. But we also can't pretend that his name means nothing. And honestly, here's where my mind keeps going with this. Mesopotamia, they looked at Gilgamesh's divine blood and basically saw it as a thing that made him a hero. Now, maybe this Jewish writer, he looked at the same description and he saw evidence of something that should have never happened. Maybe the message was that your hero, he wasn't part God, he was part of the problem. Now, that doesn't prove that this historical Gilgamesh was a Nephilim. I think he was, but it doesn't prove it. But it does show that ancient Jewish storytellers, they were already bringing Mesopotamian figures into the world of Enoch. And they were doing this more than 2,000 years ago. The question is no longer whether these stories touched. The question is, how deep does the connection go? Okay, I want you to look at what we just walked through. You had 200 watchers that swore an oath before they ever crossed the line, and they gave humanity knowledge that they could never give back. Mesopotamia, they remembered beings who came before the flood too, but they called them teachers, and they called them sages, and they called them the ones who handed us civilization itself. It's the same pattern, but it's an opposite verdict. And then you have a Jewish scroll that was buried in the cave more than 2,000 years, and it turns up carrying the name of Mesopotamia's greatest hero. And he's also standing right there on the opposite side of the flood. You see, somebody in the ancient world was already connecting these dots. We didn't start this. We're just kind of late to the conversation. But here's the thing, Mesopotamia, it's only the first stop because we are definitely going deeper. I wanted to make this one episode, but I figured it was going to be way too much, information to put in one episode. I had to separate it because next time we're going to talk about Greece and Egypt. Greece, it tells us about gods who took human women as wives. Then it also tells us that their kids were born with a natural strength. Now, honestly, that's the main reason why I wanted to do this episode, because their whole story parallels the Watchers almost to a T. And then you have Egypt. Egypt says its gods, they didn't just visit, they ruled as kings before human history even began. And here's one to hold on to until then. Greek writers say that the Titans were chained beneath the earth. Then you have the Book of Enoch that says that the Watchers were bound beneath the earth until judgment. These were two ancient prisons, but me, myself, I want to know if those prisons have the same address. Sages or rebels, gift or contraband, or heroes or evidence. Drop down in the comments and tell me which side you're standing on, because I really want to know where you stand before the next episode. Because honestly, that's the one that I really, really want to do a deep dive on. Now, before I let you go, if this episode got your wheels turning, I want you to do me a favor. I want you to hit the subscribe button and pound down on the like button if we earned it. And definitely hit that notification bell, because you don't want to miss episode 2. I'm telling you, it's going to be a good one. Now, I understand the last couple episodes we didn't have a paranormal confession. That was because I'm visiting Texas and it's kind of hard to do it here. But anyways, we're gonna bring that back probably in the next couple episodes. So if you have a story that you would like to tell me that you can't explain, something you've seen, something scared you, something that you've never told anybody, I really want to hear it. All you have to do is email me at relativeperspective76@gmail.com, or you can visit my new website at relativeperspectivemedia.com. You never know, your story might be the next one that we share on our show. Again, I want to thank you for watching. As always, I'm your host, Stephen, and I want you to remember your truth depends on where you're standing, and that is relative perspective. God bless you. We love you. Have a good night. Whew. I can't wait till next week. Y'all, really, I'm telling you, y'all want to watch next week. God bless you. Love you. Bye.